Hello, and welcome to the training on quality assurance and quality control in your forensics laboratory. Today we're going to talk about explaining what quality assurance and quality control are and what roles they play in the forensics lab. Explain how to audit your forensics lab in correlation with the ISO IEC standards 17025, 17020, how your lab can recertify for accreditation, an example of forensics lab violations that has occurred when audited, and the outcome to the audit, and a review. So let's start off with quality assurance in your forensics lab. And the definition of quality assurance is focused on making sure that procedures and or standards made are being followed and everyone is conforming to meet those procedures and standards. In your forensics labs, quality assurance is important to ensure valid, reliable, and credible results are followed, as well as making sure that every staff member is compliant to following those standards. So, quality control in your forensics lab is how an employee is expected to fulfill the quality assurance procedures and standards put in place. In the forensics lab, it is vital to make sure procedures are being followed step by step and it stays the same for any analysis of evidence. This is making sure that evidence is in its best quality with no contaminants or damage when presented to court to help prove or disprove a suspect in a more reliable, trustworthy way possible. So let's talk about why having quality assurance and quality control in your lab is important. Without both QA and QC, this can lead your lab into poor quality of work, as well as abusing the system that can lead to miscarriages of justice. This can harm your credibility and reliability of your lab, as well as harm the court system and public. So make sure that you have good quality assurance and quality control in your lab. So let's talk about how the audit process works with ISO IEC 17025 and 17020 in your lab. You must have internal audits to make sure that there is continuation and conformance with your quality system, as well as making sure that your conformance is with ISO IEC standards. Your audits must be conducted annually. This includes the auditor using a modified version of the accredited body checklist. This checklist covers observing sample testing as disciplines and any other quality that lab is expertise in. So if your lab is expertise in DNA, fingerprinting, or any other such procedures, then they must be observed. Then the auditor must review any previous documents that included audits previously and corrected preventive actions in the quality of records. Then the auditor must verify the corrective and preventive measures were carried out and is being followed and are effective in your forensics lab. With their audit team, they collect feedback about the quality standards. And if a breach is observed within the auditing process, then they can change it on the spot if needed. If they can't change it on the spot, then the forensics manager or your supervisor must conduct improvements and corrections within your forensics lab. So your lead auditor will write the final report and relate it to the ISO IEC standards 17025 or 17020. This usually states the objectives observed and express the findings relevant to standards, policies, procedures, and the quality statement documents. Then, that report must return to the quality manager or supervisor, and they respond if it conforms to the quality standards. And if needed, they correct the action to correct conformance. So, how is the audit correlated with the ISO IEC standards? The ISO IEC 17025 correlated with checking up on equipment is up to date and watching to make sure scientists is following procedures step by step. This is also making sure the equipment is prepped and calibrated each time you use it cleaned properly. The ISO IEC 17020 correlates with watching to make sure evidence is processed step by step properly at high quality stored and collected and maintained standards. So, how do you recertify your accreditation? You must reapply for your renewal 6 to a year before your accreditation expires. You must present proof that your forensics labs maintain conformance with the standards. And you must let the accreditation body know that you are renewing for recertification prior to your accreditation expires. All your documentations must be turned in for review. Once they get reviewed, you make sure that your team is prepped for the accreditation and making sure that there is a self-evaluation of the staff, watching to make sure that they know how to follow all the procedures. And renew is, as soon as that happens, you must submit a renewal application and wait for the accreditation body report for disapproval or approval. So let's talk about the violations to avoid. This is an example of a violation that occurred within an audit. A forensics lab in St. Paul police crime lab was challenged about its credibility. The audit was conducted due to the accusatory that the lab instruments may have led to contaminated evidence. What was found at the audit was that the lab failed. The staff did not follow basic procedures, as well as reports were incoherent, and they failed to test the instruments used, which were clearly not in best quality standards, as well as instruments were not clean and still had parts not up to date. These failed to follow the quality standards of ISO 17025, which states that all equipment and instruments must be clean, must follow all procedures, as well as making sure that they are tested correctly. So the outcome was that the lab was ordered to shut down, and several of the drug cases that involved the crime lab were dropped due to the poor quality and practices in the lab. $1 million went into renovations and staff changes as soon as the order was shut down from the state. And this included up-to-date equipment and lab space, as well as training street officers to help staff and hire a quality assurance manager to maintain the standards. And the lab is currently still not accredited, but it is trying to get accreditation in fingerprinting and crime scene works. So, in review, quality assurance and quality control help make sure your staff is compliant with ISO IEC standards and produce the highest quality of work. Your audit process should work to help keep your lab in check. You should know how to renew your accreditation to continue the highest quality assurance and quality control in your lab. And an example of the violations that occurred in the crime lab to avoid before audits. And this concludes our training video today.